$31 was what it cost to settle a dead man's debts in the logging camps outside Vermilion Pass. $31 and a widow's signature on a paper she hadn't been given time to read. Petra didn't understand what she'd signed until the camp foreman, a man named Galt, told her she had until sundown to clear her husband's bunk. Her husband had been dead 4 days. She'd met Callum on a supply wagon heading north out of Red Deer, 3 years before the autumn that changed everything. He was loud and generous, and he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. And she had mistaken all of that for warmth. By the time she understood the difference, they were already in debt to the camp, already too far from anything she recognized as home. When Callum fell from the timber frame in late October, he didn't die right away. He died slowly, over 3 days, and Petra sat beside him the entire time. She held his hand even when he stopped knowing whose hand it was. She didn't cry until after, when a man from the camp came to collect his tools. The camp was no place for a widow without means. Galt made that clear without cruelty, which was almost worse than if he'd been cruel. He gave her a flour sack for her belongings and told her the northern road followed the river. There was a settlement, he said, about 40 miles east. Maybe she'd find work there. Maybe someone would take her in. She made it 11 miles before her boots gave out. The heel of the left one had been loose since August, and Callum had promised twice to fix it, and now it peeled away completely in the mud of the mountain road, and Petra stood in the cold October rain, looking at it with the particular blankness of a person who has run out of the energy required to despair. She sat down on a rock beside the road. The flour sack rested against her knee. Inside it, a wool blanket, a photograph of her mother, a spare dress that had belonged to someone else before it belonged to her, and a small tin that held $7.40. Everything she had managed to save without Callum knowing. The rain came harder. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and watched the road go grey and disappear into the tree line. She was still sitting there when the horse came. She heard it before she saw it. The heavy, unhurried clop of an animal that wasn't in a hurry because it belonged to a man who was never in a hurry. The horse was a dark bay with one white stocking, pulling nothing, carrying a man so large he seemed to crowd the sky above her. He stopped. He didn't say anything at first. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected in a place where unexpected things are rare, not unkindly, but carefully, as though taking inventory. "Road's another 20 miles of nothing," he said finally. His voice was low and unhurried, like the horse. Petra looked up at him. Rain was running off the brim of his hat in a thin curtain. "I know," she said. He looked at the flour sack. He looked at her boot, the one missing its heel. He looked at the blanket that was already soaked through at the shoulders. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask where she was going, or where she'd come from. He reached down one hand, the size of a small shovel, and she looked at it for a long moment. "There's a cabin," he said. 4 miles up the draw. You can dry out." She thought about it for exactly as long as it took the cold to reach her spine. Then she took his hand. His name was Aldous. He told her that and nothing else for the first 2 hours, which suited Petra fine, because she wasn't in the mood for questions that required answers. The horse moved steadily up a track that stopped being a road fairly quickly and became instead a suggestion between trees, and Petra held on to the back of the saddle and watched the forest close around them. The cabin was exactly what the word implied: 4 walls, a roof, a stone hearth, a wood stove that had been burning long enough to have opinions about the weather. It was small and dark and smelled of pine pitch and something that had been cured and smoked, and it was the warmest place Petra had been in 3 weeks. Aldous handed her a dry wool shirt without looking at her, and pointed to the wood stove without speaking, then went back outside to see to the horse. Petra changed in the relative privacy of his absence. She draped her wet things over a nail beside the hearth and stood in his shirt, which came to her knees, and looked around at the life of a man who kept it very simple. There was a narrow cot along one wall. There was a table with one chair. There were pelts, stacked and folded. On a shelf near the door, there was an axe and a rifle and a Dutch oven and very little else. When he came back in, he started making food without consulting her about it, which was the right choice, because Petra was past consulting. He made a kind of thick stew from dried venison and dried beans, and it tasted like nothing she would have chosen, and exactly like everything she needed. They ate without talking. After, he put her on the cot and took the floor himself, and in the morning she woke to the sound of wood being split outside and a fire already burning. She should have left that morning. She knew that. The road was still there, and the settlement 40 miles east was still there. And nothing about her situation had changed, except that she was warm and her boots were drying near the fire. She made herself useful instead. She didn't ask permission. She found a broom behind the door and swept out the corners that hadn't been swept in what she estimated as 2 winters. She found a pot that needed scrubbing and scrubbed it. She found a stack of pelts that needed turning and turned them. When Aldous came in from cutting wood, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the swept floor for a long moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," said Petra. He put down the wood. He didn't tell her to stop. That was October. November arrived like a door closing. The snow came first as a suggestion, then as a certainty, then as a fact that made the road east irrelevant. Petra watched the track disappear under 3 feet of it and felt something complicated. Not quite relief, not quite dread, something in between. The mountain had made the decision for her, which was almost easier than making it herself. Aldous moved around this development without comment, the way he moved around everything. Steadily, purposefully, without visible feeling. He trapped and he cut wood, and he checked the food stores with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what winter in this particular valley required. Petra helped where she could. She learned which snares needed checking daily, and which could wait. She learned how much wood the stove burned on a cold night versus a mild one. She learned that Aldous took his coffee black and his silence seriously, and that he was, underneath the quiet, not an unkind man. She also learned that he didn't sleep well. She heard him some nights, shifting on the floor, occasionally rising to add wood to the stove at an hour when no reasonable person would be awake. She never said anything, but she started leaving the coffee ready to go, grounds measured into the pot, so that when he rose in the dark hours, he wouldn't have to find them by feel. He noticed. She could tell by the way he looked at the pot the first morning, and then looked at her, and then looked away. He didn't say anything, but he brought in an extra armload of wood that evening, without being asked, and she understood this as his version of thank you. December was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that fills a small space between 2 people who have stopped pretending to be strangers, but haven't yet decided what they are instead. They worked alongside each other in the cabin, and in the yard, and on the trapline, and sometimes their hands occupied the same tasks, stretching a pelt, stacking supply boxes, banking the fire, and the proximity felt ordinary in a way that surprised Petra. She had been afraid of ordinary before. Ordinary with Callum had meant a particular kind of grinding, invisibility. But this was different. This ordinary required her. Aldous worked around her as though her presence in the cabin was a fixed point, and she couldn't remember the last time anyone had done that. She was pulling the rope on a series of snares one grey afternoon in early January when she heard it. A crack from somewhere above her on the slope, sharp and final as a rifle shot. She turned toward the sound and saw nothing. Then she heard Aldous call out, once, low and cut short. She found him 20 feet uphill, in the trees, his leg at an angle that made her stomach turn completely over. A felled birch had shifted as he was working it. The butt end had swung and caught him below the knee, and he'd gone down hard on the frozen ground. He was sitting up when she reached him, jaw set, face the color of old paper. He looked at the leg, then he looked at her. "Go back to the cabin," he said. "There's a straight piece of ash in the wood pile, and the linen strip in the tin box under the cot. I know where it is," said Petra, and she went. She was back in 9 minutes. She'd also brought the flask of rye she'd found on the shelf above the door, which she hadn't mentioned to him before, because she thought it was probably not her business. He took it from her without comment, and drank twice while she put the ash splint against his leg. She had never set a bone before. She had watched it done once as a girl, and she drew on that memory with the concentration of a person who cannot afford to draw on anything else. When it was done, or as done as she could make it. Aldous was grey at the mouth, and the rye flask was empty, and the temperature was dropping. Getting him back to the cabin took the rest of the afternoon. He was not a small man. She got one of his arms over her shoulders, and they moved through the trees slowly, resting when he had to rest, resuming when he said to resume. The last 50 yards she talked steadily to cover the sound of his breathing, which had gone shallow and deliberate. She talked about nothing, the angle of the light, the look of the spruce trees with their snow load, the way the smoke was coming out of the cabin chimney in a thin, straight line that meant the air was still. She got him through the door. She got him onto the cot. She kept the fire high that night and sat in the single chair and listened to the wind and to Aldous breathing, making sure the two of them stayed separate sounds. He healed slowly. This was the nature of a break like his, in a place like this, in a winter like this one. He was not a patient invalid, but he was a sensible one, which was better. He didn't fight her when she brought him food or changed the dressing on the splint. He slept more than she thought he would and complained less. The days arranged themselves around his recovery, and Petra found herself grateful for the structure. Grateful, and then guilty for being grateful, because his pain was the reason for all of it. The trapline was hers now. She went out alone each morning, and came back with what the snares had to offer, which was sometimes something and sometimes nothing. And she began to understand the difference between the two and what each one meant for the week ahead. She found she was good at reading the signs. She found she didn't mind the cold in the same way she once had. It was just a condition, like darkness, like distance, something to be accounted for rather than resisted. One evening in February, Aldous asked her about her husband. She wasn't expecting it. He hadn't asked anything personal in 4 months, and she'd come to think of her history as something she was quietly carrying in her own hands, not requiring comment. She told him about the logging camp. She told him about the debt and the paper she'd signed, and Galt's reasonable face as he handed her the flour sack. She left out Callum's laugh, which had been good, and the way he'd been before the camps got hold of him, which had also been something. Aldous listened without interruption. When she finished, the fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin was darker than it had been. "The road east," he said. "The settlement. Are you still planning on it?" She looked at the coals. "I don't know," she said. It was the truth, and she could tell from the quality of the silence that followed that he recognized it as such. March came, and with it the first suggestion of light returning. Not warmth, not yet, but the angle of afternoon sun coming through the single window, landing 3 inches higher on the wall than it had in December. Petra noticed this. She found she was tracking it, the way she tracked the trapline and the woodpile and the depth of the snowpack, as information about whether things were going to be all right. Aldous was on his feet by mid-March, moving with a cane he'd made himself from a piece of ironwood, slow but no longer grey. He didn't reclaim the trapline immediately. He let her work it through the last of the cold, and she understood this as trust, though he would never have called it that. On the first morning that smelled like actual thaw, the ice loosening its grip on the creek, the spruce releasing their snow in soft collapses. Aldous came to stand beside her at the door, and they both looked out at it. "I could stay through the mud season," she said, "if the trapline needs covering." He was quiet. "After that," she said carefully, I'd want to know it was a choice, not just circumstance. He looked at her then, fully, in the way he rarely did, not inventory, not assessment, but something that took longer and landed differently. The cabin's weathered well this year, he said. That was all, but she heard what lived inside it. She reached into the pocket of her coat, the coat he'd given her in November, which she'd never returned, which neither of them had addressed, and she took out the small tin. She set it on the rail of the door between them. $7.40. She'd been adding to it all winter, small amounts, the value of work she'd tracked silently in her own head. The pelts stretched, the wood brought in, the meals made, the trapline run, the 4 months she had been keeping this place and this man running when winter had done its worst. I have been keeping account, she said. Aldous looked at the tin. $43, she said. By my measure, what I owe you for shelter, what you owe me for work, the difference is yours. She pushed the tin toward him. He didn't pick it up. $43, he said, is not what this winter cost. Then tell me what it cost, said Petra, and I'll tell you what it was worth. The creek moved under the ice, pushing toward a thaw that was coming, regardless of what either of them decided. The smoke went up from the chimney in a thin, straight line. Aldous put his hand on the tin and pushed it back toward her. Slowly, deliberately. The accounts are square, he said. Petra left the tin where it was, on the rail between them, in the morning light of the first day of spring. Then, as a free woman, she said, I'm asking you plainly, when the mud season's over and the road opens up, do you want me to go? The mountain was quiet in the way. Mountains are quiet when they're waiting for something. No, said Aldous. That was all. One word, from a man who weighed his words the way a trapper weighs a season, knowing what each one costs and what it's worth. Petra picked up the tin. She put it back in her pocket. Then she went inside to start the fire.